Senator Rennick.
Thank you, Adam Macklin, Deputy Chair. And I'd just like to talk to this amendment as well. And I'd like to start off by noting that just this week, the former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, member for Cook, said that when he was Prime Minister, the advice was that mandates weren't necessary, weren't advised in any setting other than health settings. So the question is, why do we have mandates, and why are employers imposing mandates that weren't actually the advice of the government medical authorities themselves? So that in itself shows that these mandates are completely unnecessary. We've also got evidence from the FDA. They themselves admitted in December 2020 that there is no evidence that the actual vaccine stopped transmission. Now, we've subsequently found out not only did they not stop transmission, they haven't stopped infection. So what is the purpose of discriminating against people in the workplace if it doesn't actually stop people from getting sick? Now, if you look at the initial outbreak of COVID and COVID generally, the people who were most at risk were older people who weren't working. In that working-age population, where people were healthy, there is a very low risk of actually getting seriously ill from COVID. So why have we gone out and imposed all these draconian mandates and the lockdowns and the border closures and everything like that earlier on? Why are we still here in March 2023, 2 years after the start of the vaccine rollout, imposing these mandates? They are completely pointless. But not only are they completely pointless, they are cruel and unnecessary, because for the last 18 months, from about late October onwards, I have daily received messages from people who are injured by the vaccine. And a lot of these injuries are in people who were healthy and young and would not have necessarily been seriously ill from the COVID vaccine. There are also people who had pre-existing conditions, and I'm referring here to Natalie Boyce, who had an antiphospholipid syndrome condition, who was actually at risk from taking the vaccine, because the vaccine uses phospholipids, both in its lipid nanoparticle that encapsulates the spike protein, or the mRNA that codes for the spike protein, and then yet again, when it crosses the cell membrane, the cell membrane is also made up of phospholipids. So why on earth, and we know that when the trials were carried out, that they weren't performed with people who have immune conditions. So it is a great risk. We are putting healthy working people at great risk by imposing mandates on them. And a lot of these mandates, I might add, are actually out of date, because a lot of these mandates are actually saying that you can actually still work for us if you've had 2 shots. So there's people who would have got 2 shots back in August, November 2021, and even if you looked at the initial trial data, it was only good for about 35 days. So their immunity has been completely, from the vaccine, is no longer relevant anyway. So a lot of these mandates are just in place for the sake of imposing power, command and control, rather than actually doing anything substantial. But I want to highlight, because we keep hearing, and I noticed that Senator Chisholm said that we've got proper protections in place around the COVID vaccine. Well, I just want to touch on this non-clinical evaluation report yet again for the umpteenth time, because it seems to me that people in this chamber don't actually want to read it. Because if you actually read it, you would see how pointless these vaccine mandates are. And I'll just touch on, and this is the one that I think is really important to start off with. In their trials, it was shown that there was an almost similar microscopic lung inflammation observed in both challenge control and immunised animals after peak of infections at day 7, day 8. In other words, they knew from the get-go that there was no difference between those people who were vaccinated, those animals, because they didn't test it in the people, those animals that were vaccinated and those animals that weren't. But let's have a look at the risks that we're taking here. Now, we know what the risk from COVID was, because we have about 3 years of data now, and we know that there is a very low risk of people under 60 of healthy working-age population of actually getting seriously ill from COVID. So here's the risk we're taking. if we go on the initial trial data, there was no distribution or degradation data on the S antigen encoding mRNA. So, in other words, we have gone and we've used an entirely new form of vaccine, and we've coded the mRNA, the mRNA inside the lipid nanoparticle, codes for a spike protein, but they never tested how quickly it degrades in the body or how far it travels throughout the body. So, and that's very, very important for a couple of reasons, because a normal vaccine will stay in the shoulder because it's a much, much larger protein. I mean, I know the word gets thrown around a lot, the lipid nanoparticle, but it actually does mean something. It's 1 trillionth, 1 to the power of -9. So it is a very, 1 billion, sorry. That is a very small molecule, and what that means is it can cross the endothelium, get in your bloodstream, and then travel throughout your body. And we know that because this paper shows that on page 44. It increases throughout nearly all the body organs. In particular, I'll just concentrate on one of them. In women's ovaries, the concentration doubled from day 1 to day 2, and then they stopped the trial. And women are born with only one set of eggs, oocytes, and they get inherited. They're passed via generations. So to just recklessly impose this on our children is just incredibly risky. And yet again, weigh it up against the risks of COVID to children, where we know that they have very few ACE receptors on their cell, versus the risk of actually what this can do. Because this is the other thing about this product, is that this product uses transfection. And unlike most natural organisms or molecules in the body, they can only cross the cell membrane either with the use of an enzyme or the use of an ion channel. No. This vaccine was designed, and this is where the 30 years of research went in, with the lipid nanoparticle to cross a cell membrane without having to use an enzyme or an ion channel. And what that showed in here was that you've now got 60 to 80% of infection of all cells in all organs. Okay, so your normal vaccine, your antibodies, you'll get the antigens in your shoulder, and your antibodies will come in and they'll kill the foreign body in your shoulder. Okay, in this particular pathway, they are giving you a vaccine that travels throughout your body, can enter any cell, and then it'll take over your cell's ribosomes, which are part of the organelles inside the cell, that will produce the protein, a spike protein. And that will induce an autoimmune response. It'll create both B cells and T cells. Now, your B cells are okay, they're helper cells, they create antibodies to fight antigens. But your T cells, they're known as killer cells. They come in and they kill your own healthy cells. Okay? Yet again, we're exposing people to this risk, okay, that is completely unnecessary. But not is it only completely unnecessary, it's incredibly dangerous if it goes wrong. Now, it won't happen to everyone, because the fact of the matter is this product had to be stored at -70 degrees, which meant that by the time it left the TGA, and we know how much of the mRNA was degraded by the time it left the TGA, which was about 40%. So the studies, the TGA, if you look at the batch results, about 40% of the mRNA had already been degraded by the time it left the TGA. So I can assure you, by the time it gets on the back of a truck and goes across the Australian roads, or it's sitting in some esky out at Bunnings, most of it's degraded. So consider yourself lucky if you got it and you didn't get sick. But if you're one of those people who got a proper shot of it, and when I say the shot of it, that also is a bit of Russian roulette, because they put 5 doses in one vial. Now, that again is how risky? Very risky, because fats don't necessarily emulsify evenly. So if you read the instructions, you've got to sit there and you've got to tip this little vial up and down 10 times. But you can't shake it because you'll degrade the mRNA. So you've got to do this slowly. Do you think they've been doing this slowly in Bunnings when there was a queue to the football? I would doubt it. But if you're unlucky and let's say they don't turn it upside down 10 times and emulsify it properly, and you just happen to get the fatty bit on top, which has got the actual lipid nanoparticle, you could get the hot shot. You could get all 5 doses in one. But then again, you could also get another random element to this, which is, if you actually read this document, the size of the lipid nanoparticle was between 45 nanometres and 180 nanometres. In other words, there is a variance within the lipid nanoparticles of 450%. I mean, what sort of quality control is this? So I would ask that people do support this amendment. People have a right to choose what goes into their body, and they shouldn't be the plaything of unaccountable pharmaceuticals and bureaucrats. Thank you.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.